Hey everybody, Shay here. It's the end of the month, literally minutes before midnight, before we hit May 1st. So I want to quickly give an update on the books that I ended up reading in the month of April. I didn't get all of the books done that were on the TBR, but that just means some of them end up moving into May, and I'll add some more and I'll be back for an update on the TBR for May when I figure that out. Without further ado, I'm going to jump into the first book, which was Wildcards Volume 1, edited by George R. R. Martin, and there's a bunch of other authors that are in this compilation, this anthology, mosaic as they call it. It's a bunch of short stories that take place in a somewhat continuity. I mean, not somewhat, there is a continuity of time between the short stories, and there is a progression. You're in a story and they reference the last story written by a different author. And that's what I think they mean by a mosaic style of anthology. And I thought it was a really well put together book. I remember reading this 30 years ago or so. So as I was reading the stories, I was getting flashbacks of like where I was. Like I knew where I was living. I knew where I was in. I knew what school I was in. I knew how I was talking about this in the high school cafeteria. Like I really enjoyed this as a kid, but I did not take away everything that I took away from this as an adult. I'm almost certain that I had to skip certain parts of it just because my brain couldn't wrap around some of the more politically charged narratives that were going on between the characters and the subtext that was going on. It's a very adult book. So when you're a 14, 15, 16-year-old reading this kind of book, because you haven't lived through a bunch of the shenanigans that are part of adulthood, honestly, and the complications that happen between relationships along the way, and your relationship with politics, your relationship with everything. Your understanding of the world isn't as dense as it is when you've got, a couple decades behind you. And so a book like this starts to have different meanings in the subtext of the characters that you end up exploring along the way. So highly recommended. I was not surprised that I gave this a 5-star out of 5-star. I did check Goodreads, and not everyone has my opinions on the book, but I don't know what it is. Maybe because it's a grounded version of the superhero lore and tales and the tropes that happen in that genre, but very grounded. A very brutal take, if you will, a deconstructionist take as well, I suppose, is in there. But that being said, written by a bunch of authors that I believe ran a game together with George R. R. Martin and his friends. Like they ran a superhero game back in, I guess, the 70s or the 80s. I'm not sure. This was published in the 80s, and I forget the exact story behind it, but I'm pretty sure it's likely still on Wikipedia. In any case, highly recommended. I cannot wait to get to volume 2. I'm going to try to get that into my future reading, one book a month if possible, just because it is a very dense read. This took me longer than I thought, but because they're short stories, you can just read one, you can put it down, and then you can move on with your life. For those of you who aren't familiar with Wildcards, I say check it out. It might not be for everyone, and maybe there's a very strong bias of like the comic history background for me, a love of deconstruction. I'm not sure what it is. I love this book. Moving on. I ended up rereading Demon Slayer Volume 1 because I'm going to be reading the Demon Slayer series next. That's going to be my big manga focus, and especially on the Manga Delve channel that I brought back from the dead because I really enjoy doing manga read reactions along the way. And so if you're interested in that and you want to check out what those look like, go check out the Manga Delve channel where I'll be doing the reaction analysis read of the Demon Slayer series as the next series. This was a reread, and I just had to remind myself, character names, of course, the themes. They're very simple. It's a very straightforward story. It's almost like if you're new to manga, probably a good place to kind of explore it because it's so simple. I'm also worried that it's maybe too simple that people who are just starting manga might think that all manga is like this. It's not. It's good for certain parts, but it is a little bit shallow, I would say, in terms of the writing. There's other manga that I've read that is far more dense, like Attack on Titan, for example, was a very dense manga. I mean, even My Hero Academia, the first 2 volumes I read, they're pretty dense because of all the characters moving around. There's a lot of different pieces in flight. This doesn't so much have that. It's a pretty straightforward story. I hear the anime movie of this is phenomenal. I was just in the theaters a couple months ago, and I'm pretty sure there was another movie for Dragon Slayer. I'm not sure what that is. I'd love to check them out someday, but I'm going to be reading the manga first. I think on Goodreads, there's a lot of 5-star reviews. I would not give this a 5-star review. Would maybe give it a 4, and that's like maybe if that's like a rounded up 3.5. I like the ideas of this. I like the foundation that it sets up. I like where this could go. I like the character possibilities. I like the demon possibilities, right? But from a story, architecture, structure perspective, extremely simple, and I like dense stuff. So I'm hoping that the series is just a good experience, a good romp. You know what I mean? I think from that perspective, it's pretty good. Maybe based on the age you are when you read this, probably gonna have a whole different vibe. It feels like a TikTokian kind of manga, if that's a good way of putting it. That makes this make sense. It's it clips through a lot of story beats where you're like, you don't want to spend some time building that up? Just a little bit more time? Maybe a whole chapter dedicated to the thing that took like 2 or 3 pages? It's crazy. And if it happened once, it's one thing, but it happens all the time through volume 1. What you get at the end of this, though, is you get, you know you're going to start on volume 2 is going to be the actual start of the crazy. Hopefully, crossing fingers that that's what's going to happen. But this just gives you the big premise, the setup, the theme. It's simple, but it gets him through like a year plus of becoming who he becomes. From origin to he's just awesome. And I just wish there was a bit more of a growth curve on that through the first 2 volumes, even 3 volumes, even. It takes some time. Takes some time. So still a recommend. But moving on, I jumped into World War Z by Max Brooks. I really enjoyed this. I didn't think I would enjoy it as much as I enjoyed it. I might have given this a 5-star. It might have been like a 4.5 star, but just the way that it was put together, and ultimately, like at the end, like I just felt like it was a good experience. You know, there's a bit of linearity in terms of like the faux history of this war with zombies. You get the perspective of a bunch of different people. It's like a faux reality thing, right? This whole thing is composed like it actually happened. And I thought that was a very creative way of telling a zombie story and the events of what happens to the world throughout the years that this takes place and how it spills over. And it's just an interesting way of looking at the zombie lore from that perspective. You know, usually the zombie stories are very intimate kind of perspective, POV, and the protagonist dealing with the zombie threat, and of course the degradation that comes from that. And if you're reading Walking Dead, it starts to evolve into the threat being more the humans than the zombies. This doesn't really get to that part of it. It never gets that far along. The zombies are such a force of nature threat in the world that this sets up. That doesn't really happen. They suggest that it sort of happens, but the focus of this book really is the zombie threat and how the world has navigated that epidemic. So clever. There were so many clever different parts in this that if it wasn't written the way it was written, I'm not sure how you could have pulled it off. Like you couldn't. There were so many ideas in this that somehow they were still cohesively held together because you got the jump between this interview style, investigative journalist reporting of this event. And I just thought it was so damn clever. I really enjoyed it. There were some stories that were maybe weaker than others, sure, but you knew they were only going to be like 2 or 3 or 4 pages. Then you're just going to move on to the new perspective. And it just shook things up, you know, and it kept things very vibrant, more than any short story anthology could have done. This was like a hyper short story anthology, I suppose, because you're jumping through perspective so often that you never really get a chance to like put your roots in and feel for the characters that are involved. Although you do in the short blips that you have, but not because they're people, but because it's like these moments in this faux history that takes place. Does that make sense? I'm not sure if I'm making sense. Anyways, I really enjoyed this. Again, none of the characters really stood out as memorable because they're not really the story. The story is the zombie apocalypse that happens and how humanity ends up surviving around it. It was a denser book than I thought, considering its composition, but I really enjoyed getting through this. I enjoyed it so much that I ended up reading the Zombie Survival Guide next. This is a 2003, and World War Z is a 2006. This does actually come first. How did I feel about reading this second? I didn't lose anything by reading this second because I had the context of World War Z, the book, so that when I read this, I was like, I kind of see where the ideas were coming from, and like these are kind of the notes that would have then turned into stories from the perspective of these fake characters in this fake world, fake event. You get what I'm saying? But this is like, this might have started as a joke that wasn't very much jokey. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, this feels like something you should have read as like, it's just this fun romp, not really comedy, but trope heavy. That makes sense. And it is, but it's not. Like, there's such a serious take on putting this together that you know it's supposed to be like maybe a joke, but it just doesn't stand out like that. It stands out like a very serious piece of work. Although it's a complete protection from the living dead. Silliness. I probably gave this a 4 as well. A 4 or 4.5. I really enjoyed reading the survival guide. I think reading both of these books together is, I would say, like, it's not a must, but it definitely enhances the experience of staying a little bit longer in the world that Max Brooks has created. Because none of the characters stand out as individuals of, like, the story isn't part of their perspective and their worldview because you're jumping around so often. When you read something like this that is so decoupled, it just makes the world more vibrant. I think there's a point in here where it literally says that whatever's getting written becomes this survival guide that gets handed out. That's how I read it. And it's a very short part. Just like World War Z, this is in small blips here and there. It's more like essay-esque, though. They're really trying to give you the summary of basically the entire virus, how it came to be, how it passes, how you prepare to be in the defensive versus offensive, how you then like what's the world after the apocalypse. Like, it's so good, and it feels like something that would have existed, like this handbook would exist in this world. And so these together, highly recommend reading these together. I'm not sure if I gave them both a 5 or both a 4, but they're in that range of like, they'd probably be 4.5s because I really enjoyed the experience with them. Moving on to the next series of books, it's the Eberron Trilogy, Heirs of Ash by Rich Wulf. Right here, it's basically airships, noir, steampunk, pulp, fantasy, adventure, version of Dungeons and Dragons, but it's so not Dungeons and Dragons. And like, you'd have to understand a little bit of how Eberron came to be in order to understand what that means. But Eberron was a setting that was like a fan search setting. I actually ended up submitting an idea for a setting back in the early 2000s, 3 of them at the time, because this was just a fan competition. You could send in your pitch. The guy who created Eberron, he ended up winning, and he created this world called Eberron, and it was like a mix of a bunch of genres, but it was so cohesive. It was so rich. It's an amazing setting. I ended up buying all the books. I ended up running a game in the Eberron setting for a couple of years, and I bought all the books, but I never got to finish all the novels. So I finally got back to them. I'm about midway through the entire series. I forget how many books there are, but there are a lot, maybe 20, 30, I'm not sure. Like, gaming books are kind of just like, they're just a fun read. You generally don't land on one that's like, holy crap, that was like that stood above what a gaming book feels like. Those are very rare. I might have read, I don't know, over 100 of these so far, and there might be a dozen that stand out to me. You know what I mean? This is up there as one of my favorite books, series, authors even of gaming book franchise stuff. In the Eberron series, for sure, the first trilogy of the Eberron books was written by Keith Baker, and it was pretty good. It was like, it stood out. It was, I mean, he created the setting, so of course it's gonna stand out, you know? But then the next couple ones, they were good, but they never really elevated themselves as like, they're not in my memory. I remember certain parts of them, but they didn't stand out. This had moments in it that will stand out, and maybe it's because like it did have a bit of a Final Fantasy feel, because the airship was such a huge theme in this, and the dragon prophecies is a massive thing in Eberron, but it's usually left mysterious. But this trilogy actually, it weaves it in fundamentally to the entire, like it threads it through the entire plot, and it's still left not ambiguous. There's like a motivation for it, it's a direction for it, but it still allows it to be other things inside the Eberron world. It's not just the one thing, but the one thing really drove this, and it helped the characters stitch together and create that ragtag group that you might find in something like Firefly or Farscape. And maybe that's why it really felt special to me, is because I really love those shows. Farscape is one of my favorite shows of all time. Firefly is also one of my favorite series. I just like the idea of the ragtag group coming together. It's very tropey, of course, but when done well, you have that found family feel that really holds an ensemble story together, because you're switching points of view all the time. And I got nervous in the first book that I was not going to be able to hold on to all the characters, but they get trickle fed to you. They get introduced, like a couple each book gets introduced, and they persist. By the time I got to midway through book 2 and then finally book 3, like I was invested in all the characters and their part, in the part that they were playing. And Rich Wulf actually brings it all around and makes all of it come together. And so it was like a 4-star, 4-star, and then 5-star. Like the final book nailed it. I wasn't expecting it from a gaming book series, and that's my bias. That was my bias going in. Maybe I underexpected. I liked this so much, I looked up Rich Wulf, and I was shocked to find he doesn't have any other novels out there. He has other gaming books out there, but they're more like source books and accessories. But in any case, he hasn't written novels, and this was written like 20 years ago at this point. So that's unfortunate. I think this is a very, very strong writer. I wish he wrote more stuff. I highly recommend Heirs of Ash trilogy if you're into Final Fantasy, that Farscape, Firefly-esque kind of ensemble piece set on a world that is not really Dungeons and Dragons. I think you're gonna have fun. I highly recommend it. These were a little denser than I thought. I think the font was just smaller than I'm used to from gaming books. Usually these are like rapid reads, but these ones took a bit of time. So I'm gonna be getting into more Eberron books next month, because this made me feel really good about getting back into the series. I love the world. I got immediately reinvested into the Eberron world, and I've been away from the Eberron world for about 15, 20 years. And I was just like, I'm in, let's go. Let's read some more. Anyways, and then finally I stuck in one more book before the month was over, and I actually stuck this in between book 2 and 3 of the Eberron series, and then I ended up finishing both the book 3 and this one at the same time, more or less at the same time. Now in the TBR, I mentioned I was going to read Walking Dead Road to Woodbury, because I thought this was the first book that I was supposed to be reading. That is not true. I have to start with Rise of the Governor, and then it goes into Walking Dead Road to Woodbury. I was going to attempt to read both of them. I thought I might have been able to pull through. It was a pretty fast read once you got into it. Like, the writing was very smooth. There were a lot of like subtle, funny, dark moments. There was a mix and a good balance of it. And just the way the writing was done, whether it was by Robert Kirkman or Jay Bonansinga, like, I'm relatively familiar with Robert Kirkman's humor style from the comic run that he does, of course, for The Walking Dead. There's a certain dark humor he has with the way the characters talk, and maybe a little bit of that might have come up here and there with some of the characters in this. Of course, this is based on the governor. I'm definitely not going to spoil this book because I got rigmarolled, and I'm pretty familiar with the Walking Dead comic series. I watched most of the television series for The Walking Dead. I didn't finish it because I know it deviates quite a bit here and there. Like, the characters deviate and the plot points deviate. And the later it got into the series, it definitely was not the same thing. The governor is not really the same character at all in the TV series versus the comic. And then we got this version of the governor again. I'm not going to spoil anything. And I'm going to say I was not expecting many things about this book that happened, and just my feeling about it all. Pretty sure I gave this a 5-star review. On Goodreads, it's a little lower than that. I think it's under a 4-star review on average. I enjoyed the pacing of this. There were maybe, it might have been like a 4.5, right? But Goodreads, there's no 0.5s, so I would round it up to a 5. Because there were parts in this where the chapter transitions happen so rapidly, and like these events would happen, and they would just move on. And part of me was like, I'm like, did I like that or not like it? Like, I got confused at times, because then as I kept reading, I was like, it was okay that it happened that way, and we're just moving on. Because it always reflected back on the emotions of the primary protagonist that we're sort of following in this. And the deeper you're getting to the story, the more you realize that it felt intentional. It felt intentional that things sort of sometimes clipped along, and you're like, how'd that make sense though? Like, is the person not thinking straight? Or is the person they're not thinking things through, but they're positioned as a leader? And for half of the book, I was like, I'm not really sure what this guy is doing. Yeah, again, it's hard to talk about this because I really can't spoil the way that this whole thing pans out. There are moments in this that if you read the comic, you read certain parts of it and you go, I can see how this threads and informs the governor I know from Walking Dead, the comic book. Maybe not the TV show, right? But the comic book. And then it gets into the third quarter, and then you're like, I think something is going on here that is on the surface is not what I think it is. Like, I think there might be something else going on here. And then you get to the last quarter and you're like, oh my, oh my, oh my. This is definitely not what I think I'm supposed to understand. I cannot spoil this. Damn it. It's hard to talk about this one. I'm just going to have to say, if you're a fan of The Walking Dead, if you read the comic book series, I highly recommend reading this novel. Do not get this spoiled for you. Just read the novel, and it'll be like support material for the Walking Dead series. For the background, I mean, it's called The Rise of the Governor. It's going to be about the governor. This is before he's the governor. I believe Road to Woodbury might be his story as the governor, and then there's the fall of the governor, which it's likely the ending of the trilogy of the governor's story, and that might thread with what the comic does and what the TV show does, or whatever version of them there are. This is a scenario where when you read Walking Dead content, I feel like Robert Kirkman intentionally makes it so that each media that presents stories from The Walking Dead, they always do a twist on you that is not just what's been done in the comic books. It's not just what's been done in the TV show. You kind of read this and you're still getting blindsided with reveals that you're like, but how did you do that? Because like, I've already read the stories, you know what I mean? But don't go into it thinking you know things. If you're a fan of The Walking Dead, I will highly recommend this. If you're not a fan of The Walking Dead and you read this, I can see where there are moments in this that would maybe put people off. But I think the gravitas and the importance of the events that could put people off are extremely important to the character and the development of who the governor becomes in like later on. He's still the villain. He's still the bad guy. I think the TV show really starts to twist him around. The comic does too. He becomes part of the group and stuff like that. And so he's like, see him more like an anti-hero in a world of zombies, something like that. But the comic book governor is nothing like the television governor. You don't want the comic book governor to survive anything. He's just a terrible human being. Whereas the TV show one, I think they give him a bit of redemption. Yeah, I can't spoil it. I was about to say, I can't say stuff further than that. I'm gonna stop talking about this. I'm saying that based on what your point of context is, whether it's the TV show or the comic, I think you're gonna come at this and you're going to get different perspectives that might inform your perception of the character in both of those medias, but not in the same way. Anyways, there you go. That's all I'll say about that. And then, I mean, I didn't finish it. I thought I would have finished it, but I ended up starting Monster Volume 2, the manga about the surgeon. I would say like a super surgeon, if you will. Anyways, in a world that's not really about superheroes, but there's just enough characters and tropey kind of ideas in here where I'm kind of seeing the superhero tropiness of stuff that's going on, but they're all just people. They're just real people. Because this is so highly acclaimed, I read this and go, but why is this interesting? Like, why do I find this interesting? But I'm compelled to keep reading. It's so mundane feeling, but it's not. It's the surgeon. He basically saves. This I'm not really spoiling because this is literally like the premise of the entire series. But he saves a kid that could have died. But then the kid grows up and becomes a serial killer. And that's not really a spoiler. That's literally volume 1. But it's they set you up right away knowing that, because the whole premise of the monster series is like it's that conundrum of like you're a surgeon that can save a life, but what if you save the life of the wrong person that becomes a monster and then takes lives away, right? That's the big conundrum you're kind of navigating. But I did not expect the character to develop the way that he did. By the end of volume 1, I think these are master editions. I forget what they're actually called. In any case, omnibuses, whatever you want to call it. But the end of the volume 1 of this set, he ends in a way where you're like, I didn't expect that, because he's kind of training, and it's like, oh, he's on the run from the cops and stuff like that. And so when you're into volume 2, you're now following him and he's on the run. So he kind of has this almost Batman-esque vigilante perspective. He's not really Batman, but he's the surgeon aspect of it. It's a clever way of telling stories that are just unconventional, I guess, but they still allude to the tropey stuff that you might know from comic books. That's the best way I could say it. There's like even a young boy that gets into the picture, like an orphan boy. You see what I'm saying with Batman? He's got his own, maybe Robin coming into the picture now. Maybe it's not, but because I'm not done. Obviously, I'm 3/4 of the way through, but I'm getting that vibe. And then there's just like normal characters that become like villains, but they're just people, but they have their own quirkiness to them and very unique kind of personas that end up like representing foils that are going to kind of get in his way and stuff like that. And because as I was reading the volume 1, even I was like, how are there 9 volumes of this? And even as I was starting volume 2, I'm like, how are there 9 volumes of this? I get to about this far in and I'm like, I can see why there might be 9 volumes of this. At this point, the storytelling shows that it has this promise of like fracturing off and becoming a bunch of other stories that coming back around to the main character and what he's trying to solve for. He's trying to find this serial killer and take accountability for having saved him. He wants to take the life away, but is that really going to be what's going to happen? I'm not sure, right? He's always pushing up against the code of the doctor and being a good doctor and caring for life, right, and humanity. So anyways, I find Monster a very intriguing series. I do recommend that. Like for people who want a more serious read that is still manga format, but it's serious. It's not shogun, so it's not like for teenage boys, right? It's like reading something that's more from an adult perspective. It has adult themes. Here's a weird way of putting it. Feels like a Euro comic, but it's a manga. That's how Monster feels to me. So if that intrigues you, I highly recommend Monster as well. I believe I'm probably going to give this a 4 or 5. I'm not sure if it'll be a 5, but it's likely going to be a 4-star for me at the end of the day as well. Pretty strong still, and I'm looking forward to reading more. That's the wrap up of what I've read in the month of April. I'll be back to talk to you about the next plan for the May TBR. Looks like I'm clipping through about 2 novels a week, and I'd like to start sticking in some manga along the way, especially Demon Slayer. But I'll be back to talk about the TBR later. I'll see you there. Don't forget to explore, engage, and inspire, buddy. Peace.